Welcome to Magnificat TV news program, dedicated to providing news of the Church. Today is Wednesday, May 1st, 2024, and these are our news. On Sunday, the Pope traveled to Venice to visit the Biennio, which is a great art exhibition held in that city every 2 years. Cardinal Parolin expressed his conviction that after the death of Pope Francis, everything will continue as it is now, with the same line that the Church is following. The Italian government has approved a law that will allow pro-life organizations to be inside centers where women at risk of abortion are consulted. An in-depth study into the alleged abuse and murders of Indigenous children in Canada has shown that they never existed and that the allegations were false. The Spanish government accuses the Church of being responsible for 400,000 children abuses and has decided to compensate them even though the alleged crimes have been prescribed. The Pope traveled to Venice on Sunday to visit the Holy See's Pavilion at the Biennio being held in that city and to celebrate Mass in St. Mark's Square.
The Pope's day began at 6:30 a.m. with a takeoff from the Vatican City of the helicopter that took him directly after an hour-and-a-half flight to the women's prison in Venice, where the Vatican's pavilion is located. The Church had not participated in the Venice Art Biennale since 2015, and now does so with an exhibition located in the prison entitled With My Eyes. Behind this initiative is Cardinal José Tolentino de Mendoza, current prefect of the Vatican's Dicastery for the Culture and Education. The Pope was received at 8 o'clock by, among others, the Patriarch of the Archdiocese, Francesco Moraglia. Francis then met with the 80 prisoners in the inner courtyard of the prison. Then, in the same helicopter, he was transferred to St. Mark's Square, where he presided the Holy Mass. 12,000 faithful attended. After the ceremony, he returned to the Vatican. During the meeting with the artists participating in the biennial, he asked them to turn their art into a city of refuge to rid the world of selfishness. It would be important that diverse artistic practices could be established everywhere as a kind of network of the sanctuary cities, working together to rid the world of racism, xenophobia, inequality, ecological imbalance, phobia of the poor. Venice is Francis's first destination in 2024, after visiting Marseilles in September and having to cancel his presence at the Dubai Climate Summit in November due to health problems. He plans a grueling trip to Asia from September the 2nd to the 13th that will take him to Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, East Timor, and Singapore.
The Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, believes that nothing will change with Francis' successor and that the Church will follow the current line that he has set for her.
The Cardinal Secretary of State spoke at the presentation of the book by Vaticanist Ignazio Ingrao, 5 Questions That Shake the Church, together with the Italian Minister of Culture, San Giuliano. Vatican News reports some of Parolin's statements during the presentation of the book. The most noteworthy is the repeated forcefulness with which the Italian cardinal warned that there will be no going back on the reforms undertaken by Pope Francis. The Vatican's number 2 added that discernment, which is not a simple intuition, but the fruit of continuous prayer in the Spirit, will indicate in a relaxed time of those who know how to be patient, how to continue, and what must be done institutionally. According to the Cardinal, precisely because it is the action of the Spirit, there can be no turning back. Parolin assures that we are facing irreversible processes.
The government of Giorgia Meloni in Italy will allow pro-life organizations to provide counseling to women at risk of abortion within the state-run centers.
The Italian Senate has approved the decree allowing the intervention of pro-life associations in family counseling centers. Both the decision and timing of the decree is very important, because it comes on the heels of the European Parliament's resolution in favor of declaring abortion as a woman's right in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. The authorization for the so-called maternity support groups to act alongside women considering terminating their pregnancies has been integrated into a decree on initiatives funded by the National Recovery and Resilience Plan. The amendment proposed by Lorenzo Malagola of the Fratelli d'Italia party has already been approved by the Chamber of Deputies on April 16th, just before the regional elections in Basilicata, with 185 votes in favor, 115 against, and 4 abstentions. The approved text states that regions will organize the service of the clinic and will be able to avail themselves, without new or increased charges to the public accounts, of the involvement of subjects of the third sector of qualified experience in the support of maternity. The Spanish government criticized the law a few days ago, when it was approved by the Italian Congress, which earned the response of Giorgia Meloni, Prime Minister of the Transalpine country, asking them not to interfere in Italian affairs. Italy legalized abortion in 1978. Approximately 65% of gynecologists in the country refused to perform them, reaching 80% in regions such as Sicily or the Marche, strongholds of the Brothers of Italy party.
Allegations against Catholic clergymen holding them responsible for the murder and abuse of Indigenous children in Canada have turned out to be completely false.
May 27, 2021 marked a milestone in Canadian history after it was revealed that a georadar device had detected soil anomalies with an orchid at a former residential school in Kamloops, interpreted as probable burials of 215 missing children. The school had been run by Catholics and Anglicans. 3 years later, not a single trace has been found. The Canadian media, which made a big fuss, are now silent. Following the announcement by the Tk'emlúps First Nation of the discovery of unmarked graves in Kamloops, many politicians, Indigenous leaders, and the media have thrown balance, restraint, and caution to the wind, turning the truth into a victim. Cristina Gauri, based on the investigative book of C.P. Champion and Tom Flanagan, meticulously reconstructs the whole story, providing that not a single truth was told. It was all a fake media scandal promoted by the Canadian mainstream media, who now refuse to know the truth that they trampled on. These falsehoods provoked a wave of church burnings in the country. Public discussion of the Indian residential school issues had been filled with the following claims, all which are false or greatly exaggerated. Thousands of missing children went to the residential schools and were never heard from again. These missing children are buried in unmarked graves, under or around missing churches and schools. Many of these missing children were killed by school personnel after being subjected to physical or sexual abuse, including explicit torture. The killing is properly defined as genocide. Many human remains have already been located by ground-penetrating radar, and many more will be found as the government-funded investigation progresses. It should be noted that virtually the entire church in Canada, including Pope Francis, gave credit to the falsehoods surrounding the remains of Indigenous children. The Pope repeatedly asked for forgiveness during his trip to the North American country.
In an act of discrediting the church, the Spanish government accused her, without any proof, of being responsible for the abuse of 400,000 minors.
The Spanish government accuses the church of being guilty of abuse of 400,000 minors. But, as they cannot be proved because they are time-barred, it has decided to compensate the alleged victims. The church has protested because the figure is false, and because the government is not going to compensate the rest of the victims, those of the church being only 0.2% of the total. In a statement, the Spanish Episcopal Conference has responded clearly and firmly to the gross and unworthy manipulation announced by the social communist government of Spain, which is going to pay with public money compensation to the victims of sexual abuse already prescribed only if it was committed in ecclesiastical sphere. The conference has not hesitated to immediately respond to the shameful anti-clerical attitude of the government of Pedro Sanchez, which only seeks to provoke in the Spanish population a spirit of animosity against the Catholic Church, following the example of their political ancestors of the 20th century. The excuse of the socialists and communists this time is the victims of sexual abuse. For the government, there are two types of victims: those who were abused in the ecclesiastical sphere, who are a minority of the total, and the rest of the victims. For the former, there will be public money, even though the statute of limitations has expired. For the rest, including the victims who were minors sheltered by the state institutions, not a penny. The text presented, the bishops affirm, starts from a condemnatory judgment of the whole Church, carried out without any legal guarantee, a public and discriminatory singling out by the state. By focusing only on the Catholic Church, it addresses only part of the problem. It is a partial analysis and hides a social problem of enormous dimensions.
Our editorial this week is dedicated to offering criteria to guide to the vote of Catholics in situations where there are doubts about the unsuitability of candidates.
This week, with this reflection, I want to reach a conclusion that will surely seem risky to some or even wrong, an option that I respect and will respect, and I will start from the three things that have happened these days. 3 years ago, in the year 2021, there was a news story in Canada that shocked that country and traveled around the world. In the vicinity of a former school run by religious but owned by the Canadian government, using a Gerada technique, a series of lumps hidden under the ground had been discovered in the vicinity of the school, and that without evacuating and without making any other injury, were announced as graves of children who had been taken in, educated in those schools, and who have died victim of torture and sexual abuse. More than 200, it was said, only in one school. The news was a shock. The Canadian bishops asked for forgiveness. The Pope himself asked for forgiveness. Well, of course, the media attacked the church fiercely. The Canadian government, which had been the owner of these schools, also attacked the church terribly. Several temples were set on fire. The church found herself defenseless in the face of all these attacks, humiliated and without the strength to defend the non-negotiable principles, especially, in this case, the increasingly permissive euthanasia laws that the Canadian Bishop of Mr. Trudeau was implementing. Well, this week a report has been published that proves that everything was false. The surroundings of the famous school has been thoroughly evacuated. Not a single human remain was found. It was all lie. It was all a publicly stunt to attack the church. Also this week, now not in Canada but in Spain, the social-communist government, the socialist communist of Mr. Sanchez, have presented a bill by which they are going to compensate the victims of sexual abuse by ecclesiasticals or personnel working in the church. According to this social-communist government, there are 400,000 victims, and they also say that as many as these cases, practically all of them, had not been proven because they have been prescribed. They will be in charge of compensating those victims who alleged cases have not been brought to court. The Spanish Episcopal Conference immediately and rightly protested. It has said, first, this figure is false. Second, if the cases have prescribed and not been brought to court, how can we know that the allegations are true? In the event that they have occurred, which they have not. And third, why does the government decide to compensate the victims of the church that, according to all studies, are 0.2% of all victims of sexual abuse of the minors, and not the rest of the victims, including those who have suffered the consequences of sexual abuse in their own institutes and schools under the protection of the government, and not in institutes or centers of the church? because there is a clear objective to attack the church, to make it appear before civil society as a monster. And why? Why is it that? Well, because we are in an election campaign and because the government has to cover up many corruption scandals that splash it, or scandals that are not corruption and are of political nature, such as the amnesty law, etc. Third case in Italy, a positive news. The government of Mrs. Meloni, which is a coalition government between conservative forces, which her rivals identify and immediately calls fascist. All those who are not socialist or communist are by definition, according to them, who are the ones who decide fascist. Well, the conservative government of the Italy presided by Mrs. Meloni has managed to pass in the Parliament of Law, by which representatives of pro-life associations should also be present in the counseling centers for women who are at risk of abortion and who come to this center seeking advice, as established by Italian law, to explain the other alternative that these women have been before having an abortion. This is something unpredicated in Europe and in the world. But this has been a scandal in Italy, and terrible accusations have been made against Mrs. Meloni. But of course, it is a very positive fact for the defense of life. 3 events of this week. I would like to make a reflection based on them. Is it that the government, everything that Mrs. Meloni's government does in Italy, everything it does is good from the moral point of view? I am not going into other aspects. Is everything good? Decisively no. Is everything that the government of Mrs. Justin Trudeau in Canada or Mrs. Pedro Sanchez in Spain does all bad? Is it absolutely all bad? No. However, speaking of the non-negotiable principles, it is clear that the government of some is not the same as the government of others. And what does that mean? It means that we have to try as Catholic voters who follow what the church has taught, especially in recent years, who follow the non-negotiable principles when it comes to discernment about their vote. We have to try to support with our vote those parties that, without being perfect, even being far away in some things from what a Catholic would wish, nevertheless represent a lesser evil. And here I think we must clarify one thing. Last week I said it, I repeat it again, and I understand that the lesser evil sounds very bad to some, and I think it is right. So I think it is much better, and I want to do it from now on, to talk about the possible good, not the absolute good, not the perfection in the real world in which we live, which on the other hand, we must try to reach, but the possible good. There is an expert, a philosopher, a doctor in philosophy, an expert in these issues of the possible good applied to politics, Dr. Rodrigo Guerra, who says the following: to focus on ethical demands while neglecting the political feasibility of those ethical demands, the political feasibility of making it feasible, using results in losing everything. You are a purist. You want that the party you want to vote for to be perfect, and that it identifies 100% with the Catholic social doctrine. I think that it is not a bad thing. I think it is a very good thing to look for a party that is 100% identifiable with the Catholic social doctrine, and especially the 3 non-negotiable principles. But what does the Catholic Church teach us? What did St. Paul II teach? When St. John Paul II establishes that politicians who with their votes are approving an abortion law are automatically excommunicated, he also says that a Catholic politician is allowed to vote for an abortion law as long as in this way the approval of an abortion law must much more permissive than the one being voted for is stopped, is prevented. That is to say, St. John Paul II establishes the criterion. Let us leave aside the lesser evil, the criterion of the possible good. We must aspire, we must try to achieve the greatest possible good until we reach perfection. But in the meantime, while we are here and now, in these situations in which we find ourselves, we have to find a solution and an alternative. Of course, it is valid for all countries. I am thinking in a special way in those who are now in an electoral process, like the United States or Mexico. But I think it is valid for all of them. Of course, also for Spain, for all countries. The first thing we must try to do is to have unity, and to put aside as far as possible the differences between those who are against the greater evil. I am speaking for the point of view of the non-negotiable principles. That is what has been achieved in Italy. Among the three parties that form the government coalition, there are huge differences, and in fact, typically Italian. They are constantly fighting, but they have been able to bring out in a parliamentary law in favor of life. They know how to put aside their differences to achieve something positive. Why can't this be done everywhere? First, you have to try unity among those who at least have many things in common and who are against their greater evil. If this is not achieved, I consider it a serious if it is not achieved. And that is responsibility of those who are the representatives or leaders of those parties. And I consider it because it is used by the rivals to divide. And divide and rule has been said since Roman times. But it is that not achieved, because personalisms, or it is considered that the differences are so absolute and gigantic that an agreement cannot be reached. The Catholic voter has to make some decisions, and if you vote your representative seeking the greater good, the absolute good, perfection, but with all that you are getting that the one who represents the possible good is very far from the greater good that you want to achieve. But that is the one who represents the possible good. He or she cannot achieve it. What does the Catholic voter have to do? Does he have to choose between the possible good, or does he have to choose to lose everything? Of course, everyone has to act in conscience, but we are in a very serious situation in all aspects. I want to refer to the three non-negotiable principles. There are other aspects such as the unity of the country. I want to focus on this, that as Catholics we have to keep in mind. We have to look for the maximum possible good. We have to look for it. But in many occasions we have to accept and support the possible good. A doctor, a surgeon has to try that the one who is on the operation table comes out healthy and whole. But perhaps if he has gone ring in a leg that has no choice but to cut off his leg, of course this is a medical example that some will say cannot be compared with a moral example. In practice, unfortunately perhaps, but in reality, the best is sometimes the enemy of the good. We have to opt for the possible good, and we have to encourage the parties that have things in common, even if they are not all, in the fight against the greater evil. We must encourage the parties to unite, and if not, at least with our vote to choose the possible good, because otherwise we risk losing everything. Until next week, God willing.
We will continue to keep you informed of what is happening in the church. See you next week, God willing.